Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the ruins of a home that once promised warmth, but instead became a tomb. The Harlow cabin, perched on a lonely ridge outside Hollow Creek, is nothing now but blackened timbers and collapsed beams. The fire had raged so violently that the very earth around the foundation was scorched, as though the mountain itself wanted to erase what happened inside. But flames do not hide everything. They leave behind bones, ash, and questions. Before you dive deeper into this chilling truth, consider hitting like and subscribing, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with the time and place you're watching, so I know you're still out there. And we'll dive into tonight's journey together. At dawn, neighbors walked cautiously toward the smoking ruins, boots crunching over charcoal and broken glass. The smell clung to them: wood, fabric, and something heavier, unmistakable burnt flesh. One man, prying at the floor with a broken beam, shouted out. Beneath the boards lay a pit, dark and shallow, where the fire's breath had not fully reached. When the first body was pulled into daylight, the men stumbled back. Thomas Harlow lay sprawled across the heap, skin blistered, clothing fused to his bones. Beneath him were Margaret and the children, their small forms twisted together, the fire disguising but not concealing wounds that told of something more violent than flames alone. Some skulls were split, bones hacked. It was not the blaze that killed them, it was the axe. The count stopped at 7, but the Harlows had 8 family members. 6 children should have been found. Only 5 were there, which meant one daughter, 16-year-old Clara, was missing. Was she buried deeper in the ashes, or had she walked away, leaving the others to burn? In the hills of Appalachia, the Harlow family worked the land the way their fathers and grandfathers had before them. Life was measured in harvests. In the soil beneath Miller's Ridge offered little mercy. Winters were lean, summers unforgiving, and every mouth in the cabin depended on the strength of Thomas Harlow, the man who bore his name with stubborn pride. Thomas was broad-shouldered, quick to labor, and quicker to temper. To Hollow Creek's townsfolk, he was the kind of man you wanted on your side in a barter, but not someone you wanted to cross in a tavern. His word was law, inside the walls of his one-room home, and his fists enforced it. When sober, he could charm neighbors with talk of crops, horses, and trade. When the jug of whiskey came out, however, the charm curdled into something meaner. Beside him stood Margaret, his wife of 20 years. She was quiet, a woman shaped by endurance rather than choice. Her frame had grown frail after 6 births, yet she carried herself with a dignity that seemed out of place in the mud and smoke of their cabin. She had long ago accepted her role to soothe her husband's rages, to shield the children when possible, and to make peace where there was none. The children filled every corner of the cabin. Samuel, tall and strong for his age, basked in his father's pride. At barely 14, he was already trusted with the plow and the axe, Thomas calling him the man of tomorrow. The younger ones, 5 in all, clung to Margaret's skirts, noisy, needy, and easily overlooked in the chaos of farm life. And then there was Clara, 16, sharp-eyed and restless, two outsiders. She appeared dutiful, the girl who rose before dawn to kindle the fire, fetch water from the creek, feed her brothers and sisters before turning to the fields. Yet beneath that obedience was a hardness, a will her father despised. Clara was not content to be silent. She had learned to stand tall, to speak when struck, and her refusal to bend became a constant thorn in Thomas's side. For Clara, the days blurred into a cycle of drudgery. She oversaw the younger children, boiled corn mush, sewed patches into torn garments, and still carried a hoe into the fields to work beside Samuel. When the sun fell, she cooked the evening meal, scraped the pots clean, and laid the children down on straw pallets. Only then did she steal a moment for herself, sitting by the fading firelight, staring at the cabin door, imagining a life beyond Hollow Creek. Her father saw none of this as sacrifice. To him, she was a burden, a daughter already overdue for marriage. In the eyes of Appalachia in 1846, a girl Clara's age had one purpose: to leave home with a husband and lighten the load of her family. But Clara had refused. Suitors had come, farmhands, mill workers, even a widower with land of his own, but she dismissed them all. She would not be bartered like livestock. This defiance fueled Thomas's rage. Every refusal became a public humiliation. Each time Clara turned a man away, it whispered to the town that Thomas had lost control of his daughter. And control was the one thing he would never surrender willingly. The cabin itself was little more than 4 walls and a roof patched with pine pitch. A single hearth fought back the cold, its smoke lingering heavy in the air. Beds were nothing more than bunks nailed to the walls, straw stuffed into ticking. Privacy did not exist. Quarrels erupted quickly in such a cramped space, and blows were common when Thomas's voice rose above the children's chatter. Clara bore the brunt of it, not because she was weak, but because she refused to cower. Neighbors remembered her glare unyielding, almost accusing. Some admired her strength. Others whispered that she carried darkness in her. She worked harder than Samuel, they said, stronger than most boys. Her back bent under firewood or baskets of corn. Yet her father only praised his son, dismissing Clara's labor as expected, never exceptional. It stoked in her a quiet resentment, one that grew sharper each year. Beyond the Harlow's cabin, tension stirred. Thomas had made trades with men from Ashford County, Elias Boone, and Henry Talbot, horse traders with long memories. They claimed he had sold them a sick animal, swindled them out of their coin. Though Hollow Creek folk avoided conflict when possible, word of the dispute spread quickly, and each retelling added weight to the idea that Thomas Harlow had enemies outside his home as well as within it. By the end of summer in 1846, the Harlow's harvest was strong. Tobacco dried in the barn loft, corn stacked high in the crib, shoes for the children, perhaps even a new dress for Margaret, seemed certain. Yet prosperity did little to cool the anger that smoldered inside the cabin. Thomas's hand found the jug more often, his words more cutting. Margaret moved silently, her eyes downcast. Samuel absorbed his father's pride and swagger, but Clara was left cornered, her will grinding against a man who would never see her as equal. In those last weeks before the fire, Clara's silence turned heavy, no longer the silence of obedience, but of calculation. Her gaze lingered longer on her father's every stumble. She clenched her fists tighter when his voice rose. To those around her, she remained the dutiful daughter, but in her mind, the line between endurance and escape was thinning. The neighbors of Hollow Creek could never have known it then, but the Harlow home was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. Inside its walls, resentment layered upon resentment. A father and daughter locked in a battle neither could win. And when that spark finally came, it would consume them all. September 18th, 1846, began like so many others on Miller's Ridge. The mist clung low over the fields, and the chill in the air hinted that autumn had arrived. Thomas Harlow was in good spirits that morning. Payday had come, and he left the cabin whistling, mounting his horse for the long ride into Miller's Ridge, where he had been hired to cut timber. He kissed Margaret on the cheek, ruffled the hair of his youngest child, and clapped Samuel on the shoulder with pride. To the casual eye, it was the picture of a hard-working man providing for his family. But beneath the veneer of routine, tension was stirring, like a storm cloud forming unseen on the horizon. The Harlow cabin sat quiet as the sun climbed higher. Margaret busied herself with the wash. Clara led her siblings into the field to gather root vegetables. By afternoon, Samuel stacked wood near the barn while Clara helped her mother prepare supper. Everything seemed ordinary, except for the gnawing weight in Clara's chest. She knew her father would return with whiskey, and whiskey never came alone. It brought shouting, accusations, and blows. As the day waned, 2 riders appeared from the direction of Ashford County. Elias Boone and Henry Talbot were men known for their tempers, and word in Hollow Creek was that they had been cheated by Thomas in a horse trade. The animal he sold them, they claimed, had been sick from the start. They wanted their money back, and Boone, especially, carried his grudges like knives. When they arrived at the cabin, Thomas was not there. Margaret, weary but polite, told them to come back when her husband returned. The men said little, only exchanged a dark look, then turned their horses toward the tavern in Hollow Creek. By nightfall, Thomas returned, saddlebag heavier than usual, jug of whiskey sloshing inside. He set his pay down on the table, boasting of the day's labor, then pulled the cork free. Within an hour, the mood shifted. His voice grew sharp, his words directed not at Samuel, who earned his praise, but at Clara. She sat stiff at the table, fists in her lap, while Margaret whispered for peace. "You think you're better than the rest of us," Thomas slurred, pointing a shaking finger at his daughter. "Refusing men, refusing your place. You'll shame us all before long." Clara's jaw tightened. She said nothing, but her silence seemed to inflame him more. He struck the table so hard the dishes rattled, the younger children shrinking back into shadows. Margaret tried to calm him, but Thomas rose, hand reaching for Clara's shoulder. She pulled away, and the look in her eyes, cold, unflinching, set him roaring. Outside, the sound of horses broke the moment. Boone and Talbot had returned, bellies full of whiskey, anger sharp on their tongues. They demanded Thomas step outside, shouting about debts and lies. The younger children cried as their father stumbled to the door, axe still leaning against the wall where he had left it earlier that day. The argument spilled into the yard. Voices clashed, Thomas defending himself, the two men cursing him as a cheat. Neighbors would later testify that the shouting carried all the way down the ridge, though none dared interfere. Samuel hovered near the doorway, unsure whether to intervene. Clara stood in the shadows of the cabin, her eyes flicking between the men and the axe buried in the chopping block nearby. The fight did not come to blows then. Boone spat into the dirt. Talbot cursed, and the men mounted their horses again, vowing they would not be cheated without consequence. Thomas returned inside, veins in his neck bulging, fury only stoked by their threats. He poured another drink, slammed it back, and turned once more on Clara. "You bring shame to this house," he growled, staggering toward her. "Think you can defy me? Think you can walk out that door free?" The blow landed hard. Clara reeled, her chair tipping, her lips split open. The room froze. Margaret clutched the youngest child. Samuel stood stiff as a fence post, unable to move. Clara rose slowly, the taste of blood hot in her mouth. Something in her gaze shifted, and her father must have seen it. For the first time, he hesitated. Night deepened. The children were herded into their bunks. Margaret retreated with tears into the corner, and Thomas slumped in his chair, the jug nearly empty at his side. Clara sat awake long after the others, staring at the flickering light of the hearth. Every breath of her father's drunken snores felt like a drumbeat inside her skull. It was in those hours, neighbors would later speculate, that the decision was made. The axe outside, its handle rough but familiar in her hands. The voices of Boone and Talbot echoing in her ears, reminding her of violence promised but not yet delivered, and the years of bruises, commands, and humiliation boiling together into something that could not be contained. Some say the first blow landed before Thomas even stirred. Others insist he woke, cursed, and reached for her before the blade fell. Whatever the truth, the outcome was the same. The cabin that had long held silence and resentment now filled with the wet crack of wood against flesh. Blood spattered the wall, hissed as it struck the fire. Margaret's scream broke the night, cut short as the axe swung again. The children never had a chance. In their sleep, they never knew what hand ended them. The pit beneath the floorboards, long used for storage, became their grave. Each body dragged, arranged, covered by planks, as if to hide shame along with flesh. The fire that followed was both cover and curse, consuming the only home they had ever known. By the time the flames lit the sky above Hollow Creek, Clara was gone. Whether she fled in terror, guilt, or triumph, no one knew. But the cabin burned, the ridge glowed red, and by dawn, 7 members of the Harlow family were nothing but ash and memory. The missing piece, the absence of Clara, would haunt the town more than the charred bodies ever could. The morning after the blaze, smoke still rose from the ruins of the Harlow cabin like a black signal against the pale sky. Men from Hollow Creek, summoned by the sight of fire on the ridge, gathered around the smoldering timbers. Their boots sank into damp ash. The smell of charred wood and something far worse clinging to their clothes. It was one of the neighbors, Elijah Morton, who uncovered the first horror. He pried loose a plank half buried in soot and staggered backward when the pit revealed itself. Beneath the boards, in that crude cellar, bodies lay stacked. Thomas Harlow's broad frame sprawled across the top. The skin of his face burned, but not enough to hide the axe wound splitting his skull. Beneath him was Margaret, her thin arms twisted unnaturally, her dress stiff with dried blood. Then came the children, 5 in all, lifted one by one into the daylight. Their small forms bore the same brutal signature, heads cleaved, limbs broken, their final sleep turned into slaughter. Some of the men dropped to their knees, gagging, while others muttered prayers through clenched teeth. Each corpse dragged from the pit tightened the knot of dread in their stomachs. But when the counting ended, confusion spread. There should have been 6 children. Only 5 lay on the grass. One was missing Clara, the eldest daughter, the sheriff. A heavy-set man named Hiram Tate arrived by mid-morning. He looked grimly over the scene, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool air. His eyes fell on the blackened axe pulled from the stump outside the cabin. Human hair clung to the blade, fused with dried blood. He ordered it preserved, though most of the onlookers already whispered the same conclusion. This was no accident of fire. Rumors spread fast. Some insisted Thomas, drunk on whiskey, had slaughtered his family before setting the cabin ablaze. Others claimed Boone and Talbot, the horse traders from Ashford County, had carried out their threats and exacted revenge in the bloodiest way imaginable. But the absence of Clara cast a shadow on both theories. Had she been taken, or had she been the one swinging the axe that night? Hollow Creek was restless. Fires burned low in hearths as families whispered about what they'd seen. Mothers pulled their children closer. Fathers double-checked the locks on their doors. In a place where neighbors depended on each other for survival, suspicion seeped into every corner. By Sunday morning, the search for Clara began. Men scoured the ridge, combed through barns and outbuildings, even walked the banks of the creek in case her body had been dragged away. Nothing was found. But 2 things surfaced that deepened the mystery in the ashes of the cabin. A torn dress stained with blood, and under Clara's small trunk, hidden away, her father's land deed and Bible. The sheriff grew uneasy. He questioned Boone and Talbot, who denied everything. They admitted they'd argued with Thomas, but swore they had left Hollow Creek before nightfall. Their wives vouched for them. Though suspicion lingered, the sheriff couldn't dismiss the bloody axe, nor the missing daughter. And in the tight-knit world of Appalachia, it was easier to believe the sins of a family than the violence of strangers. By Monday, the fear turned to outrage. Farmers gathered in Hollow Creek Square, demanding answers. "We got 7 bodies in the ground and 1 girl walking free." One man shouted. "What more proof do you need?" Sheriff Tate urged patience. But even he could not shake the image of Clara's cold stare from church pews, her silence among neighbors, the way she seemed too proud for her place. He knew the Ridge folk would not rest until they had someone to blame. Meanwhile, the story spread beyond Hollow Creek. Riders carried the tale down into Miller's Ridge and even as far as Ashford County. Newspapers took it up, printing lurid headlines about the butcher of Hollow Creek, the brutality of the killings an entire family. Hacked and burned was enough to grip readers with horror. But what set tongues wagging most was Clara's absence. To some, she was a victim, abducted by her father's enemies. To others, she was a murderess, clever enough to vanish before dawn. The graves were dug on Tuesday, 7 mounds side by side at the edge of the Harlow land. Margaret and the children were lowered in first, then Thomas last. Some neighbors turned away when the casket closed over him, muttering that a man who drank and beat his family may have reaped what he sowed. But all agreed that Clara's absence was louder than any sermon. That same evening, whispers grew darker. A hunter claimed he saw a figure moving near the tree line at dusk, a girl with hair loose around her shoulders. Another said he'd found footprints by the creek, small, bare, leading away into the hills. Fear bled into fascination. The image of Clara, wandering alone through the woods after slaughtering her family, became the ghost story Hollow Creek could not let go. For days, every creak in the night, every shadow along the ridge carried her name. Mothers warned their children, "Mind your manners, or Clara Harlow will come with her axe." Fathers cleaned their rifles twice over, listening for footsteps outside their cabins. What had begun as tragedy was turning into legend, the kind that sank its teeth into a community and never let go. But behind the fear was a truth no one could escape. 7 bodies were in the ground. 1 girl was missing, and the blood-soaked axe still leaned against the sheriff's desk, whether victim, fugitive, or killer. Clara's shadow stretched over every home in Hollow Creek, and if she truly was the one who swung the blade, the most terrifying thought was this: nothing stood in her way now. The investigation into the Hollow Creek Massacre began under the weight of expectation. Sheriff Hiram Tate, already a weary man with a thinning mustache and rheumy eyes, carried the burden of a community that demanded answers. 7 coffins in the earth had shifted the town from grief into a feverish need for justice. Yet every direction he turned seemed to lead him into deeper confusion, as if the crime itself resisted being solved. He started with what was tangible: the axe. It had been found wedged in the stump beside the cabin, its blade blackened by soot. Strands of hair clinging stubbornly to the steel. Tate studied it under lamplight, fingers grazing the splintered handle. To him, the weapon was both confession and riddle. It told of violence, but not whose hand had guided it. The sheriff brought in Boone and Talbot for questioning once more. The 2 horse traders sat in his cramped office, stinking of sweat and tobacco, swearing they had nothing to do with the murders. They admitted again that they had threatened Thomas, but insisted their words were just drink-fueled bluster. Their wives, pale and trembling, vouched for them both. Men had been home in Ashford County by midnight. The distance between their farms and the Harlow Ridge made their story possible, but not airtight. Then came the matter of the blood-stained dress, found buried under a pile of charred boards. The cloth bore more than soot. Brown stains streaked the hem, and though no science of the day could prove beyond doubt what it was, every eye saw blood. Some whispered it belonged to Margaret. Others claimed it was Clara's. Sheriff Tate examined the seams, noting it was finer than anything Margaret had worn in years. That fact alone raised eyebrows. How had Clara come into possession of such a dress? As Tate moved through the investigation, testimonies began to conflict. A farmhand swore he had seen Clara running toward the Thompson place the night of the fire. But when the Thompsons were questioned, they denied it. Another neighbor claimed he'd heard a girl's scream cut through the night air, but could not say if it was fear or rage. In Hollow Creek, rumor was as thick as smoke, and every story carried the weight of belief, no matter how fragile. By midweek, Tate was visited by Reverend Collins, the wiry pastor of Hollow Creek's only church. The Reverend's face was drawn, his voice hushed as though afraid of being overheard. "Sheriff," he said, "that girl carried darkness with her. I've seen it in her eyes during service. She never bowed her head, never joined in prayer. Mark my words, something unholy was stirring inside her." Such words, though cloaked in scripture, only deepened Tate's unease. Was Clara a victim hiding in the woods, or the very monster the town needed to fear? The sheriff turned to Margaret's kin in Miller's Ridge, hoping for clarity. Her sister, a gaunt woman named Ruth, told him that Clara had always been strong-willed, always at odds with her father. Thomas tried to break her spirit, she said softly, but Clara wouldn't bend. I used to tell Margaret, one day it'd end badly. I didn't think it would be this. That testimony seemed damning. But then another voice rose from the jail. A woman named Lydia Ward, serving a sentence for theft, claimed Clara had confided in her weeks before the fire. She said she wanted to leave. Lydia told the sheriff through the bars, said she'd rather die than spend another year in that cabin. Whether true or fabricated, Tate couldn't tell, but the words clung to him as he walked home that night. And then there were the whispers of things no lawman could write into his report. Some spoke of strange lights seen near the ridge the night of the fire, flickering like lanterns though no one walked there. Others swore they heard voices carried on the wind, children crying, a woman wailing, and beneath it all, the heavy chop of an axe echoing in the darkness long after the fire had burned out. Whether superstition or something darker, it fueled Hollow Creek's terror. Tate, though not a man of fancy, felt it too. When he stood near the pit where the bodies had been found, he swore he could hear faint scratching under the earth, as though the dead had not fully settled. At night, in the silence of his own cabin, he thought he saw Clara's eyes at his window watching, waiting. Sleep eluded him, and in the morning, his reflection looked more like the faces of the dead than the living. By Friday, pressure mounted. Reporters arrived from Ashford County, their pens scratching feverishly as they recorded every lurid detail. Headlines screamed of the Hollow Creek Axewoman, printing Clara's name alongside sketches that made her look half wraith, half girl. The town square buzzed with anger. Some demanded a manhunt, others called for Boone and Talbot to be hanged outright. In the absence of truth, vengeance became the only language people understood. But Tate knew he needed Clara, dead or alive. Only she could stitch the story together. When word came that a girl matching her description had been seen near an abandoned barn 2 miles from Hollow Creek, Tate rode hard with 2 deputies at his side. The barn stood crooked against the horizon, roof caved, door yawning open like a wound. Inside, they found nothing but dust and cobwebs, yet in the straw lay fresh impressions, the shape of a body curled in sleep. Clara had been there, and she was close. Returning empty-handed only inflamed the crowd further. Hollow Creek no longer cared for patience. "If the sheriff can't bring her in," one man shouted during a gathering at the square, "we'll find her ourselves." Tate had to draw his revolver just to keep the men from marching into the woods with torches. That night, he sat alone at his desk, staring at the axe. He thought of Margaret's soft voice, of Samuel's wasted strength, of the small children who had never seen another spring. He thought of Clara's cold stare, her silence in the pews, her refusal to bend. The evidence was scattered, fragile as ash, but the truth weighed heavier than any he had faced. And still, the question clawed at him with every passing hour: had Clara Harlow been driven to madness by years of cruelty? Or was she merely the scapegoat for violence born of men already sworn to vengeance? The ridge was dark, the woods restless. Somewhere out there, a girl walked alone, or a killer hid in plain sight. The trial that followed was less a search for truth and more a spectacle. By November, word of the Harlow murders had spread far beyond Hollow Creek. Farmers, merchants, and even townsfolk from Ashford County crowded into the courthouse at Miller's Ridge. The square outside filled with wagons and horses. Reporters scribbled furiously into their ledgers, and strangers pressed against the windows just to glimpse the accused. At the center of it all was Clara Harlow. She had surrendered herself weeks earlier, appearing at the sheriff's office one Sunday morning. Mud streaked across her dress, eyes sunken but steady. "I didn't do it," she whispered as Tate placed her in a cell. Yet her presence was proof enough for many. How could she walk free when 7 others lay in the ground? Alongside her stood Elias Boone and Henry Talbot, the horse traders. Their reputation for temper and their quarrel with Thomas Harlow ensured they too would stand accused. The prosecution painted a lurid picture. Boone and Talbot, drunk and vengeful, had stormed the Harlow cabin with axes in hand. But when they left, Clara alone remained unscathed. To the jury, it seemed as if guilt hung over all 3. Inside the courtroom, every whisper carried weight. Witnesses stepped forward, one by one. Some swore they had seen Clara wandering the ridge alone, face smeared with soot. Others recalled hearing Thomas cursing Boone's name the night of the fire, but testimony was fickle, shaped by fear and rumor. The strongest blow to Clara's defense came from a fellow inmate, a woman jailed briefly for theft, who claimed Clara had confessed in the dead of night. She told me she struck her paw first. The woman insisted, and once the blood started, she couldn't stop. Gasps filled the room. Clara sat rigid, lips pressed tight, but her eyes betrayed no fear, only exhaustion. Her lawyer argued the witness was a known liar, desperate for favor with the court. Still, the seed was planted, and the jury's faces hardened. Then came the scandalous turn. Boone himself, when pressed, admitted that he and Talbot had not been at home as their wives had claimed. Instead, they had been with Clara in the barn behind the Harlow cabin. Murmurs erupted, women gasped, and men cursed under their breath. Boone's voice did not waver. "We lay with her," he said plainly, "but we shed no blood." He claimed Clara sought them out, desperate for attention, reckless in her defiance of her father. The revelation fractured the courtroom. Some saw Clara as wicked, a girl who had betrayed her family's honor. Others saw Boone's words as a coward's attempt to smear a young woman and protect himself. But the effect was undeniable. The jurors leaned forward, no longer seeing Clara as a frightened girl, but as someone entangled in deceit and sin. Clara's own testimony did little to save her. She spoke of her father's rage, of the blows he dealt her, of her fear that night. She claimed she had fled into the woods when he raised his hand, hiding in a neighbor's barn until dawn. She swore she never touched the axe, never raised a hand against her kin. Yet when asked about the blood-stained dress found in the ruins, her answer faltered. "I cut a chicken for supper," she whispered, voice breaking. The courtroom erupted in disbelief. Reverend Collins took the stand, his voice solemn. He spoke of Clara's pride, her refusal to kneel in prayer. There was something dark in that girl, he said, a defiance that no good Christian should carry. His words carried weight among the God-fearing jurors, heavier than evidence. The prosecution hammered the final nails the axe with hair and blood. The missing land deed and Bible found in Clara's belongings. The testimony of betrayal in the barn, piece by piece. They painted Clara not as a victim, but as the architect of her family's ruin. When the jury retired, the courthouse buzzed with fever. Hours later, they returned with a verdict as swift as it was damning. Guilty. Clara Harlow, Elias Boone, and Henry Talbot were all found guilty of 6 counts of first-degree murder. The sentence, death by hanging. The crowd erupted, some in satisfaction, others in horror. Clara stood as the sentence was read, her face pale but unflinching. Boone cursed under his breath. Talbot hung his head. For Hollow Creek, justice seemed certain, yet the story did not end there. Weeks later, as the gallows were prepared, an appeal was filed. One of the jurors, it was discovered, had declared Clara guilty before the trial even began. The conviction was overturned. A new trial was ordered, but that trial never came. Papers were lost, witnesses vanished, and the state of Tennessee quietly dropped the case. Clara, Boone, and Talbot walked free, their names forever stained, but their necks spared. The people of Hollow Creek were left with a verdict more chilling than any gallows could deliver: no justice, no closure, only shadows. And from that day forward, whenever the wind rattled the trees along Miller's Ridge, folks whispered that Clara Harlow was still out there, whether as victim or monster. No one could decide. When the case slipped quietly into silence, Hollow Creek was left with a wound that never healed. The graves of the Harlows sat in a crooked row at the edge of the ridge, their markers weathering faster than the years could count. People avoided the site, whispering that the soil still stank of smoke on damp mornings, that children who played too close heard voices under the ground. Clara Harlow faded into rumor. Some swore she left Appalachia entirely, changing her name and carving out a new life where no one knew her past. Others claimed they'd seen her wandering in the woods long after the case had gone cold. Her dress torn, her eyes hollow, carrying an axe across her shoulders. Boone and Talbot melted back into Ashford County, but their names were cursed in every tavern. They were liars, cowards, or worse, accomplices who had escaped the hangman's noose. For Sheriff Tate, the unanswered questions gnawed at him until his death. He kept the Harlow axe locked in a chest beneath his floorboards, never speaking of it again, as though hiding the weapon could hide his failure. Reverend Collins preached sermons about sin and damnation, but even he could not keep Clara's name from his lips when warning children about disobedience. She became less a girl, more a specter, the Hollow Creek daughter. A story told to frighten the young into obedience. But beneath the folklore remained a truth that no one dared settle who had swung the blade that night. Was it Thomas, drunk and raging, lashing out until he turned the axe on himself? Was it Boone and Talbot, taking vengeance and covering their tracks with fire? Or was it Clara, the girl who would not bend, who finally struck back and left her family in ruins? The records end abruptly. There is no second trial, no confession, no justice, only silence, only ash, only the faint memory of Clara's shadow lingering in the smoke. And maybe that is the most terrifying part, because if the one who killed the Harlows never paid the price, then somewhere, somehow, their bloodline of violence walks free. So let me ask you, if you were standing at the edge of those 7 graves, looking down into the soil that swallowed them, would you believe Clara was the victim or the killer? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And remember, before you leave, hit like and subscribe. If you dare to keep digging into the darkest corners of history, because the next story I tell might keep you from sleeping tonight. Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a story that doesn't open with a scream in the night, but with a photograph silent, fragile, yet more terrifying than blood on the floor. You stand in front of it now. Boston, October 1905. A family frozen in time. The Harringtons, posing in their grand parlor beneath a chandelier that still hangs there today. Edward, the father, sits straight in his tailored suit, his lips curved in a smile that feels more like a threat than warmth. Margaret, his wife, delicate and pale, holds their infant son in the lace-trimmed arms. And then there are the baby's eyes. William does not look at the camera. He does not look at his mother. He looks off-frame, pupils wide, as though he sees something moving just beyond the edge of vision. His tiny fingers clutch the christening gown as if bracing against a hand you cannot see. At first glance, you think it's a proud portrait, another wealthy Boston family showing their prosperity. But the longer you stare, the heavier it feels. The father's grin never softens. The mother's lips are pressed thin. And the child he looks like he already knows. That photograph, meant to preserve joy, preserved something else, fear. Within weeks of that session, William would be gone. The records say sudden illness, a tragedy explained away like countless others of the era. But you can sense the silence of that nursery, the stillness of a crib no longer breathing. Photographs capture more than faces. Sometimes they capture warnings, and William's gaze has been holding its secret for over a century, waiting for you to notice. Before you dive deeper into this chilling truth, consider hitting like and subscribing, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with the time and place you're watching, so I know you're still out there, and we'll dive into tonight's journey together. You step back into Boston at the turn of the century, a city split in two. On Commonwealth Avenue, horse-drawn carriages carried the wealthy past rows of polished brownstones. In the North End, immigrant families crammed 6 to a room, children coughing through nights of coal smoke. The Harrington mansion stood like a fortress between these worlds, red brick, tall iron gates, the scent of coal fires leaking into velvet-draped parlors. It was a house meant to intimidate, a house that reflected the man inside it. Edward Harrington had been groomed from birth to control. Born in 1868, he was the eldest son of a shipping magnate who taught him that compassion was weakness. You picture the boy Edward in the backyard, trapping sparrows in his small hands, breaking their wings just to watch how long they struggled. Neighbors whispered that he drowned another child's dog in the creek, standing still as the animal thrashed, eyes flat and unblinking. Teachers praised his brilliant, sharp memory, perfect recitations, but admitted he had no warmth. Other children avoided him, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. When Edward's mother died, he didn't shed tears at the funeral. His father nodded approvingly, proud of a son who never let emotion compromise composure. That lesson calcified in Edward's bones. By the time he was 30, he had converted fading family wealth into new fortunes banks, railroads, real estate. His face appeared in newspapers beside headlines about progress. He was photographed at charity banquets, shaking hands with clergy. He looked like the perfect gentleman, but those who worked under him whispered that charm turned sharp in private. A single misstep from a clerk could end in humiliation. A single mistake from a servant in dismissal. Then came Margaret Hartford. You imagine her at 19, pale, slender, raised in a household of etiquette lessons and gilded constraints. Her family fortune came from railroads that had carved through New England, but their wealth was waning. Edward's proposal was practical. The Harrington Empire would absorb the Hartford name, and in return, he would gain legitimacy as part of old Boston money. To society, it was a union of dynasties, To Margaret, it was a contract signed in silk gloves. The wedding of 1902 glittered. The newspapers praised her gown. The orchestra, the guest list filled with senators and bishops. But behind closed doors, Margaret's journal revealed something else. I do not feel married. I feel purchased. He watches me as though I am something to be owned. By 1904, she had given birth to their first child, Clara. For a brief time, Margaret allowed herself to hope. Clara's laugh filled the nursery, her tiny hands clutching ribbons. But Edward treated her less as a daughter and more as a fragile investment. When Clara fell ill that winter, the doctor prescribed simple rest. Yet Margaret saw Edward measuring drops of soothing syrup into the baby's bottle, his expression blank as Clara's eyelids drooped. By spring, Clara was dead. The certificate read fever, a tragedy common enough to silence suspicion. But Margaret wrote in secret. Her breath slowed after he touched her. He did not grieve. He calculated. Her health deteriorated after that. Doctors declared she suffered from nervous exhaustion, prescribing laudanum. Edward made sure the bottles were always full. His control, hidden in the sweet, bitter liquid. Margaret's body weakened. Her protests faded into whispers to the world. She was a delicate socialite. To herself, she was a prisoner. Boston thrived around them. Electric streetcars rattling, factories roaring, parades celebrating progress. But in the Harrington mansion, silence grew heavier. Curtains stayed drawn. Servants came and went quickly. Some spoke later of the eerie atmosphere. One maid confessed there was never laughter, only the sound of clocks ticking and Mrs. Corpton Harrington crying behind closed doors. Then came William. October 1905. Margaret clutched him with desperate devotion, whispering that this child would live. She refused to let servants handle him, holding him even in sleep. But Edward's eyes never softened. At dinner, he remarked coldly, "Children are fragile. It is foolish to grow too attached." That autumn, you find yourself in the photographer's studio. The flash bulb hisses. The baby flinches. Margaret grips him tighter. Edward stands stiff, impatient. The photographer jots in his ledger. Mother nervous. Father detached. Infant unusually fearful. Stared left of camera entire session. You see it too. That gaze, already warning. Edward ordered the print framed in silver, hung above the mantel in the parlor to visitors. It was a symbol of wealth. To Margaret, it was a curse she could not escape. You imagine her stealing glances at it, heart racing, as William's eyes seemed to follow her through the room. By winter, letters to her sister grew desperate. He forbids me from leaving with the boy. He says William is delicate, but I know he wants us here, under his watch. The baby stares when Edward comes near. He does not cry. He only waits. Servants whispered the same. A nursemaid confided to a friend. The child doesn't wail when the father approaches. He goes quiet, as if he knows better. Soon after, she left the house without explanation. By year's end, Christmas lights glowed across Boston. Carolers sang in the streets. Bells rang from churches. Inside the Harrington home, the fire flickered on polished brass, and Margaret rocked William near the hearth. She whispered prayers into his hair, while Edward's shadow stretched long across the rug. To society, the Harringtons were untouchable. To you, standing in that room, the air feels poisoned already. Something cruel waits in the silence, sharpening its teeth. Winter 1905 grips Boston in a way you feel in your bones. The city is muffled under snow, horses' hooves clicking against cobblestones, breath of pedestrians billowing in the frigid night air. Inside the Harrington mansion, the warmth of coal fires and heavy draperies does nothing to ease the chill. It's a different kind of cold, one that seeps from within, a silence that thickens in the nursery upstairs. You find Margaret there often, rocking William in her arms. Her lips brush his forehead with whispered prayers, her voice cracking with exhaustion. She believes her closeness can hold off the darkness pressing at the edges of her world. She thinks if she keeps the baby against her chest, she can shield him from whatever has already taken Clara. But you see the truth in her eyes. She knows something is waiting, and it has nothing to do with illness. Edward enters the nursery with that same deliberate calm. His footsteps don't rush. They measure. His voice is smooth, a veneer of authority no one questions. In his hand is the small brown bottle. You watch the way it glints in the lamplight, the way Margaret recoils at the sight of it. The child is restless. He says softly, "A drop will help him sleep." Margaret shakes her head, clutching William closer, but Edward's gaze pins her in place. There is no discussion. He tilts the bottle, lets the amber liquid fall into the milk, and sets it firmly into his son's mouth. The effects creep in quietly. William no longer wails the way infants should. Instead, he stares, dark eyes too wide, breaths too shallow, his lips pale after each feeding. His tiny hands twitch and then go limp, his body surrendering not to sleep, but to something heavier. Servants exchange uneasy glances, though few dare to speak. Mrs. Colby, the wet nurse, confides that she once entered the room to find Edward leaning over the crib, pressing the vial to the baby's lips. When she gasped, he turned to her with that same unnerving calm. "Medicine," he said, slipping the cork back into place. "You need not concern yourself." She left the house within a week. Margaret records her dread in secret, scribbled pages hidden beneath her pillow. His hands are so cold, even by the fire. His lips are pale. Edward tells me I am imagining things, that I am too fragile to trust my instincts. But I know my child is not well. I know it is him. You can almost see the ink blotted with tears, her hands shaking as she wrote. The night it happens, the house is unnervingly still. Outside, snow falls silently against the tall windows, muffling the city beyond. Inside, only the faint hiss of the oil lamp fills the nursery. Margaret, drained from nights without rest, slumps in a chair beside the crib. Her hand dangles over the edge of the blanket, still reaching for her son. Sleep pulls her down despite her terror. Edward appears in the doorway. You see the way his shadow stretches long across the wallpaper patterned with roses. He pauses to listen, then steps into the room with the bottle in hand. The ritual is precise. He pours the laudanum into the milk, measures each drop with a banker's calculation. He lifts the baby carefully, presses the nipple to William's mouth. The infant swallows, instinct stronger than resistance. You watch as William's eyelids flutter, fighting weight he cannot lift, his breath slow, his chest rising and falling less with each minute. And then, silence. A silence so complete, you feel it pressing against your ears. When Margaret wakes, the chair creaking beneath her, she knows instantly. She rushes to the crib, lifting William into her arms. His skin is cold. His fingers curl stiffly, frozen in a grasp for something never within reach. Her scream cuts through the house, raw and piercing, shaking the chandeliers. She clutches him to her chest, begging, rocking, as though motion could restore breath. Edward stands in the doorway, expression carved from stone. His voice is low, deliberate. It was God's will. The physician arrives at dawn, heavy coat dusted with snow. He listens briefly, shakes his head, and writes the words, "Sudden infant death." Infant mortality is common. He explains gently, as though repetition will soften the blow. He sees nothing else, no marks, no cause beyond what medicine of the time can name. Margaret collapses, body convulsing with grief. Edward signs the necessary papers, calm, as if finalizing a business contract. But whispers begin. Sarah O'Leary, one of the servants, tells a neighbor she saw Edward leaving the nursery that night with the bottle tucked into his coat. The child was alive when I lit the lamp, she murmurs, and gone by morning. Fear silences her from saying more. Margaret's grief deepens into terror. Her letters to her sister grow frantic. No one believes me. They praise him in church, call him a man of strength. While I bury my second child, they look at me and see hysteria. They look at him and see dignity. I think I am next. Doctors dismiss her words, diagnosing her nerves, prescribing more laudanum to quiet her suspicions. You sit at the dinner table across from Edward weeks later. He raises a glass of brandy, his voice carrying through the hall. A man must face hardship with composure. He declares, "Grief should never unman us." The guests nod, applaud his strength. Margaret sits in silence, eyes hollow, fingers trembling against the tablecloth. No one notices her. On the mantel, the portrait hangs in its new silver frame. Guests admire it, complimenting the artistry, the wealth it represents. But when you look, you see something they don't. William's eyes, frozen wide, seem to stare through time itself past the camera, past his parents, into the dark presence standing just outside the frame. For Edward, this is not tragedy. It is success. He has learned how easily wealth shields him, how quickly society explains away infant death. He knows that silence can be bought, and grief can be weaponized. You realize William's death is not the end of his cruelty. It is the beginning of a pattern, a system sharpened with precision. And as you stand once more in that parlor, you feel the weight of the silence pressing against your chest. The portrait doesn't just remember William, it remembers what his father did, and it waits, as though daring you to look away. The year after William's death. You notice how quickly the Harrington house regains its composure. The black mourning drapes are lifted from the windows, the heavy curtains drawn back to let in pale Boston sunlight. Guests return, soothed by Edward's impeccable hospitality. They call him strong, a man who bears loss with dignity. But you know what they don't. The silence upstairs is not mourning, it is calculation. Margaret is pregnant again by spring of 1906. She does not write of joy, only dread. I feel as though I am carrying another death. She confides in her hidden journal. You picture her sitting at her writing desk, hands trembling as she lifts the pen, her eyes darting to the locked study where Edward keeps his vials. She prays for this child's life, but the house itself seems to whisper otherwise. In 1907, Charles is born. His cry pierces the air, and for a moment, Margaret allows herself to believe. She cradles him with desperate devotion, watching every breath. But Edward treats his new son as he treated the others, detached, calculating. When Charles cries, Edward insists he needs remedies for restlessness. You watch Margaret's face pale as Edward measures laudanum into the milk. Just a drop, he assures, voice steady. To quiet him, Margaret protests, but her words fall into silence as heavy as the curtains. Weeks pass, and you see the signs repeat themselves. Charles's eyelids droop unnaturally, his lips faintly blue. He stirs, only to cough weakly, his once strong cries fading into whimpers. Margaret paces the nursery, pleading for doctors, who shrug and call it weakness of the lungs. They prescribe more tonics that only worsen the decline. Edward watches from the doorway, his expression unreadable. By winter, Charles's body grows limp in Margaret's arms. His breathing slows until it stops altogether. The physician writes respiratory failure, the same vague phrase that erased countless infant deaths of the era. Another tiny coffin leaves the Harrington mansion. Another funeral procession moves solemnly through the icy streets. Edward stands tall, hand on his wife's back, as mourners murmur about resilience to the world. He is admirable to you, watching from the shadows. He is perfecting his method, but he is not finished. In 1909, Eleanor is born. Margaret's hope has burned down to embers. She keeps her daughter close, refusing to let nursemaids or servants take shifts. Her letters to her sister are desperate warnings. He comes into the nursery with bottles in his coat. I do not sleep. I cannot. If I close my eyes, I fear I will wake to silence again. That autumn, Edward insists on another portrait. The family gathers in the parlor once more, posing before the same velvet drapes. You stand beside the photographer as the flashbulb bursts. Margaret clutches Eleanor tightly, her face pale, her eyes hollow. Edward sits stiff, impatience etched into his jaw. But Eleanor is not looking at the camera. She is looking at the mirror behind it. When the print develops, you see what no one at the time noticed in the reflection. Edward's hand at his side, holding the small vial. The pattern continues. Eleanor grows weaker each month. Margaret begs Edward to stop, her voice breaking. She is all I have left. But Edward leans close, his whisper sharp as a blade. You will lose more than children if you defy me. His shadow swallows hers as he turns away. By the summer of 1910, Eleanor's body is laid to rest beside her siblings. The official cause illness, as always. The Harrington plot at the cemetery grows. 3 graves in 6 years, each marked with polished stone that cannot tell the truth. Neighbors begin to murmur of a curse. No child survives in that house, they whisper. But you know, it isn't curse or chance. It's Edward. Steady, deliberate, unstoppable. Servants notice but stay silent. They hear the cries that cease too suddenly, the faint clink of glass in Edward's pocket. One maid later admits she found tiny smears of bitter liquid on the nursery wallpaper where a bottle had tipped. But she left without a word, knowing a man like Edward could ruin her life if she spoke. And Edward grows bolder. He attends dinners, laughs at banquets, and speaks of resilience in speeches printed in newspapers. He has discovered that wealth buys silence. That tragedy wears respectability well. Death becomes his tool, quiet, bloodless, invisible. You walk through the Harrington mansion now, and the air feels heavier with each step. The portraits on the wall don't show a family. They show a timeline of children disappearing one by one. Each frame captures eyes that are more haunted than the last. Tiny faces already aware of danger they cannot name. And every guest who visits, every neighbor who calls, praises Edward Harrington's dignity, blind to the predator in plain sight. By 1912, Margaret is a shadow of herself. She walks the halls with slow steps, her body weakened, her voice silenced by years of fear and laudanum. Edward thrives, acquiring more property, more influence. He has mastered the art of murder without suspicion. And you, standing in that parlor beneath the silver-framed portraits, feel the weight of the pattern pressing down. It is not just cruelty, it is escalation. Each child is a rehearsal, each death a perfecting of method. The Harrington name gleams in the newspapers, but inside these walls, it is written in the silence of children's breaths that never return. By 1913, Boston is a city of contrasts. You walk its streets and see progress everywhere. Electric trolleys clattering, factories spilling smoke, new libraries opening their marble doors. Yet you also see sickness, poverty, children coughing blood in the alleys of the North End. Infant deaths are common, tragedies written into daily life. Against this backdrop, the Harrington family blends their losses into the city's statistics. To the public, 3 small coffins over 7 years are unremarkable. But to you, to anyone who dares look closer, the pattern is unmistakable. The first to sense it aloud is Dr. Jonathan Reed. He is young, ambitious, still naive enough to believe truth will prevail over money. You picture him standing in the Harrington nursery after Eleanor's death. Gloves dusted with chalky residue from the infant's lips, his brows furrow as he writes the word respiratory failure on the death certificate. But hesitation lingers in his pen. Later, in his private journal, He scratches a line under the entry. 3 infants, same family, same vague cause. This is not chance. Reed begins his quiet investigation. He revisits his notes from William and Charles, remembering the faint discoloration of their lips, the unnatural stillness. He consults textbooks, comparing symptoms, again and again. The answer surfaces laudanum, readily available, cheap, undetectable in small doses, but fatal to children. He underlines the word 3 times. You follow him one cold evening as he pays another visit to the Harrington mansion under the guise of condolences. Edward greets him with impeccable courtesy, offering brandy in the parlor. The silver-framed portraits gleam above the mantel, the dead children's faces frozen forever. Reed's eyes linger too long on William's stare. Edward notices, his smile tightening. Later, Reed drifts toward the study. Through the crack of the half-closed door, he catches a glimpse of the locked cabinet, a faint, sweet smell clinging to the air. Laudanum. He knows it instantly when Margaret enters behind him, pale and trembling, her pupils wide from her own prescribed doses. She tries to speak. Her lips form words that never leave her throat. Then, Edward's shadow appears in the doorway. Reed swallows his questions and leaves. You walk with him through the snowy Boston night afterward. He mutters to himself, "If I speak, I'll be ruined. If I stay silent, more children will die." His breath clouds in the street lamp light, but his resolve weakens. The police hear his concerns eventually, but you stand in the dim station and feel the indifference. Officers laugh, shaking their heads. "Children die all the time," one says, scratching his chin, "especially in poor homes. Why would we question a man like Harrington? He pays for half our parish roof." Another officer smirks. "Maybe the family's cursed. That's all." Their voices are weary, uninterested. For them, the deaths of rich infants mean nothing compared to daily violence in the streets. Servants whisper their own testimonies, but fear keeps them quiet. Sarah O'Leary, the maid, tells a neighbor she saw Edward slip the brown vial into his coat the night William died. Another servant admits she once wiped sticky residue from the nursery wallpaper, her hands smelling of bitter opium for hours afterward. They tell each other these things in kitchens, alleys, and back pews at church, but never to the press, never to the police. And so the truth becomes a ghost. You walk the Harrington mansion yourself in your mind, each room speaking in its own way. The nursery smells faintly sweet, as though medicine still lingers in the air. The wallpaper holds small smudges, like fingerprints pressed in desperation. In Edward's study, the locked cabinet hums with its secret, a faint clink of glass heard if you lean close enough. In the parlor, the portraits feel alive, the children's eyes following you, their stares unblinking. Sometimes, when you are quiet enough, you think you can hear them. A cry cut short, a lullaby breaking into sobs, the sound of breath halting, replaced by silence so heavy it bends the air. Whether it is memory or haunting doesn't matter. It feels real. Doctor, Reed pushes harder. He gathers his notes, bottles, testimonies. One evening, he confronts Edward directly. "Mr. Harrington," he says carefully, "3 children do not die the same way without cause. Laudanum in the home, so much more than any man would require." Edward does not flinch. He leans back in his chair, hands folded. "A man in my position suffers migraines," he replies smoothly. "Is it illegal to possess medicine? Or are you suggesting that grief has made me a murderer?" His eyes glint like steel. Reed's voice falters. He leaves with nothing but humiliation. The church remains silent. The newspapers continue to praise Edward's philanthropy. Police refuse to act. And Margaret, her voice is smothered under laudanum and fear. In her diary, you read the truth written in shaky hand. "I cannot stay here. I see him measure the drops. I smell it on his breath. But who will believe me? I am only a wife. My words will vanish, and my children will vanish with me." Years slip by. No charges are ever filed. Reed keeps his journal locked in his desk. Entries growing more desperate. Servants scatter, their whispers dissolving into rumor. The Harringtons continue their dinners, their church appearances, their polished lives. Society refuses to look. But you see, you gather the scraps. Margaret's diary, Reed's notes, the servant's whispers, the photographs. Together, they form a story more complete than any police file. You see that Edward Harrington did not suffer tragedy. He orchestrated it. Death was his tool, silence his accomplice, wealth his shield. And when you leave the Harrington mansion in your mind, stepping into the cold Boston night, you realize the investigation was never designed to succeed. The city did not want the truth. Justice bowed to money. The only evidence left is the silence of those rooms, the frozen gaze of children in photographs, and the words of a doctor who knew too much, too soon. You wonder if it had been you in Reed's place. Would you have shouted louder, or would Edward's smile, practiced and razor sharp, have silenced you too? You return to the story, certain you know its shape: a father, 3 dead children, a wife silenced. But when you dig deeper, when you sit with the documents in the archive and the photographs spread before you, the shape shifts into something even darker. Because sometimes truth isn't buried, it hides in plain sight, waiting for someone to read what others refuse to see. It begins with the photographer's ledger. You hold the fragile book in your hands, pages browned with age. October 1905. Mr. and Mrs. Harrington. Infant son William. Mother nervous. Father impatient. Infant fearful. Gaze fixed left of frame. Suggested reshoot. Father declined. Below that, another note you nearly miss. Mother requested exclusion of several poses. Whispered to keep negatives safe. The photographer must have sensed something. His pen captured what words could not be spoken aloud. Then there are Margaret's papers. Some survive only as fragments. Letters her sister preserved. The ink is uneven, smudged, sometimes trailing off mid-sentence. You read them carefully. I find bottles hidden behind the books in his study. He insists they are for his back pain, but I have never seen him take them. He watches the children too long, as though calculating. Another, written after Eleanor's birth. If you receive this letter, keep it safe. If anything happens, let the world know it was not illness. He brings death with him. And then the diary-torn pages found decades later beneath a nursery floorboard. The handwriting grows frantic as the entries progress. One, dated only a week before Eleanor's death. Chills you tonight. I heard her cry. Stop suddenly. When I ran, Edward stood there, bottle in hand. He smiled when I entered, as if daring me to accuse him. I cannot protect them. I am drowning in silence. The twist sharpens when you follow Edward beyond Margaret. By 1915, she is gone from the mansion. Officially, she is visiting relatives for her health. Some believe she fled to her sister's house. Others whisper Edward confined her in a sanatorium, ensuring her voice would be dismissed as the ramblings of a hysterical woman. Whatever the truth, Margaret never returned. Her diaries stopped. Her presence in the city's society pages vanished. Edward remarried in 1917. His new wife, Helen Morrison, was a widow with 2 young children to the outside world. It was a story of healing a man rebuilding his family after tragedy, a woman finding stability for her offspring. But you know what's coming. By 1919, Helen's son is dead of pneumonia. In 1920, her daughter follows. The cause listed as wasting sickness. Within a year, Helen herself succumbs to grief and declining health. Edward buries them all and quietly inherits her wealth. You trace the financial records and see the pattern as clearly as blood on snow. Insurance policies signed months before each death. Properties transferred into Edward's name. Accounts swelling while graves filled. He had not only taken lives, he had turned them into ledgers. Profits measured in silence. The city of Boston. Now, entering the roaring 1920s. Celebrated men like Edward. Banks expanded. Skyscrapers rose. Prohibition filled speakeasies with jazz and smoke. In the midst of this modern world, Edward was applauded as a benefactor, a man who had endured more personal tragedy than most could bear. No one asked why tragedy followed him so closely, but the house remembered. When you walk its halls, you feel it pressing in. The nursery air is colder than the rest of the mansion, as if it refuses to forget. The wallpaper carries faint stains, shaped like small hands pressing against it. In the parlor, the portraits no longer look like heirlooms. They look like warnings. Each child's eyes meet yours with an intensity that makes it hard to breathe. And then there is Eleanor's photograph. At first, the mirror in the background seems ordinary, but stare long enough, and you see it, the faint reflection of Edward's hand. Fingers curled around the neck of a glass vial. He couldn't even leave it aside during a portrait session. The children weren't looking at nothing. They were looking at him, and they knew. Maybe that's why the house still feels alive. People who later lived there claimed they heard soft crying from empty rooms, or the lull of a woman's voice breaking into sobs. Some swore they saw fingerprints reappear, on the nursery wall after it was repainted, or shadows standing by the crib long after the furniture was gone. When you pause, even now, you think you can hear it too, a tiny breath cut short, the silence that follows heavy as stone. The truth revealed is this: Edward Harrington was never cursed. He was the curse. His children tried to testify with their eyes. Margaret tried to leave evidence in letters and floorboards. Even the photographer tried to preserve suspicions in his ledgers. But no one wanted to hear. Doctors dismissed it as hysteria. Police laughed at talk of curses. Neighbors whispered and moved on, and Edward thrived, untouched. His respectability, a mask more impenetrable than any alibi. You realize the real twist is not only that he killed it, is that everyone helped him hide it. The city itself conspired through silence. And now, more than a century later, the fragments speak louder than the lies ever did. When you leave the Harrington house in your mind, stepping into the night, you feel the children's eyes following. They are still speaking. It was never that they couldn't. It was that no one dared to listen. You stand at the end of the Harrington story, but the silence doesn't let you go. Edward lived on until 1932, his reputation untarnished, his fortune secure. Newspapers printed his obituary with praise banker, philanthropist, community leader. Not one line mentioned the children who never grew, the wives who vanished, the bottles that left only silence behind. The house itself changed hands many times. By the 1950s, it had been divided into apartments. Tenants complained of cold spots, of faint crying that drifted through walls at night. In the 1970s, renovations uncovered scraps of Margaret's diary, the shaky handwriting finally speaking again. And in the 1980s, the photographs resurfaced at an estate sale. William's eyes staring into a world finally ready to ask questions. You think about the investigators who failed, the doctors who signed away lives with vague diagnoses, the neighbors who whispered of curses instead of crimes. They're gone now, their silence buried with them. But the evidence survived in portraits, in diaries, in whispers that refused to die. You walk through the rooms one last time in your mind. The nursery feels colder than any winter outside. The wallpaper still seems to carry prints the size of tiny hands. In the parlor, the portraits remain, eyes fixed, watching. And in the mirror of Eleanor's photograph, you still see it. Edward's hand, curled around the vial. The children were never blind. They saw their killer. The aftermath is not justice. It never was. The case was never tried. The killer never punished. Instead, the story survives as a shadow, a reminder of how easily wealth can bury truth. And yet, the children's gaze endures, their silent testimony outlasting their father's fortune. Now it's you who must carry it. You have seen the fragments, felt the silence, heard the echoes. You know the truth. Edward worked so hard to erase. And before you turn away, you have to ask yourself if the portraits could speak. What would they say to you tonight? Would those small eyes plead for recognition or warn you that some legacies never die? So let me ask you, if you moved into a house and found a portrait on the mantle, a baby staring at something just beyond the frame, would you dare to stay the night before you dive into your own thoughts? Consider hitting like and subscribing if you truly enjoy stories like this. Drop a comment with where you're watching from. And tell me, would you keep that photograph? Or would you burn it before it ever looked back at you?